be as much as eight times. So there are various studies conducted, and we also internally measured this. So there was a study conducted by Oracle, and then you see the exponential nature of this graph. And our internal measurements also somewhat similar and within this ballpark. The power represented by a fan or a set of fans within the server could be as much as 10 to 15% of the entire power that a server takes. So this is actually pretty significant in the context. So keeping fan under a regulated control is important. It saves cost. Let's look at power draw dependency on various workloads from a point of view of an SSD. So we measured, we basically presented our SSD with three different type of workloads. One is where we subjected it to what we call as a worst workload, which is a large sequential writes, basically. And then some light I/O workload, which is a random mix of reads and writes, small random reads and writes. And a third workload where we kept the SSD running idle without running anything. And as you see, the delta between these three workloads, basically between the worst workload and the light workload, the worst workload and the idle workload, is pretty significant. It can be as much as 6 to 8 watts. And this is a single M.2 card. On a typical add-on card, you could have 4 of these. And in a server, you may have more than one of those add-on cards. And when you talk about a data center with thousands of servers, this could add up to a pretty significant number. I think the interesting fact here is that power that is drawn by an SSD is a leading indicator of how much hot it can get. So it's basically saying the workload really determines how hot an SSD gets. Here we look at this from a point of view of server and the fan RPM. So as you see, again, here we just have two workloads. One is the heavy or the worst workload we just described, and the second one is when we just kept it running idle. After a while, as you see, is the RPM is all because of that heavy workload that is on top. So basically, all that additional power drawn is because of power that is drawn by the fan running at the high speed. Now, in order to do this experiment, we actually implemented dynamic fan control to show the difference between the power drawn by the fan when it's running idle versus running at full speed because of a heavy workload. So workload really affects how much at what speed the fan runs, and that means how much in turn the power it draws. Here we are looking at similar data on a different controller. And again, we are presenting the SSD with two workloads. One is we're running nothing, and in another case, we're running a pretty heavy workload. Let's discuss a little bit about this heavy workload and its effect on an SSD. The heavy workload we just described is a large sequential I/O. And if you keep running this 24/7, and as you know, SSDs have a limited PE cycles, a pre-rated life of its own. So if you really keep running at this workload, you will run out of its life in a fraction of time. And depending on the configuration, the size of SSD, that fraction of time can vary. But in one instance, we could see it could run out of its life within 70 days. Now we know from our practical experience that's not true. And if we really run at this speed, we will run out of SSDs. So, which means this workload is really impractical. So what it means, don't run your fan at the highest speed to serve a workload which is impractical, which is not going to happen in real life. in real life, the workload always varies, and there can be some peaks and valleys, and I mean, and there may be cases where it's not running anything at all. So we measured the speed at which the fan runs between these two instances, and it goes, the RPM goes from 6,000 to 11,000, and the corresponding power jumps from 24 watts to 40 to 60 watts. And all that additional power drawn is because of the fan itself, and there's nothing actually happening other than that. And the power cost savings because of this can be significant. In fact, our calculations say that you could save at least 20% of the cost of the SSD itself over the period of its life by just saving the power by not running fan at the maximum full speed always. Now, as you know, if you have been following the cost of the NAND at the rate at which it's falling in the last 2 years and the indicators for the next few years, and power costs are not really going down, these savings could be even further. And when you look at this from a context of a huge data center or multiple data centers, these savings can be significant. We have had customers with install bases of thousands of controllers, sometimes 2 within a server, and then someone like Facebook probably runs hundreds of thousands of servers. So in the context of that, you can see the savings could be significant. So what we did, it's here as a brief description of what we did. The specification was out there on the OCP website. Basically, it provides 2 methods, and we choose a method where our SSD itself emulates a temperature sensor. In this case, it's a temp 421. So the motherboard, the BMC, will treat our controller SSD as a temperature sensor itself. And it has a predefined offsets that come with a known I2C slave address. And you read at a certain offset to get a certain temperature out of it. And then you can identify the device with its vendor ID, device ID to know exactly which device it is. And the method is simply just to, first of all, read, you first send an offset itself from where you want to read the data from, and then subsequently read the data from that offset. So a very simple SMBus block read mechanism. Now this method can be further extended. In fact, the NVMe committee has this NVMe basic management protocol, which is pretty similar, and then some of these data coming from that. Extend this method to really read other aspects of an SSD. One of the very important aspects of an SSD is how much life is left, so you can actually plan for replacement if it need be. And then what is the spare capacity? Am I running out? Am I on track with the SSD life that I expect out of it? Or a drive activity metrics, like how much data has been written over time, how many power cycles are on the SSD. You can do power monitoring if there is an active power monitoring circuitry on the add-on card of the SSD itself. And as I mentioned earlier, since the power is leading indicator of temperature, you can have a pre-warning of how hot the SSD could be getting in future. And there could be critical warnings that you want to have a quick and swift action on, and those can be read as well. So in summary, the temperature monitoring of PCIe SSD cards using I2C sideband helps you to dynamically control your server fan to cool off, and you could keep that dynamic under control. Depending on the workload, you can keep it up or down, and that really helps save costs because you don't have to run it at the highest speed always. And this simple monitoring can be extended to get other aspects of an SSD, like SSD health, the power, and diagnostics. So that's it. Any questions?
Did you find that you had to do any feedback control in your algorithm? You want to avoid the fan oscillating up and down, right? So if a load comes in, causes the system to warm up, you raise your fans, now things cool down, the fans go down, oops, now it's warm again, fans have to go up. And so you can wind up with a phenomenon where the fan is kind of, oscillating.
Well, that's a good point. And actually, in certain workloads, it can really happen. So I think we can really build a hysteresis there to really, and in our experiment, we did try out a few things to really simulate that happening. And you can build a hysteresis to control the fan speed. So the BMC algorithm can be a little more smarter on that. So it looks at a particular temperature, and if it really, and there could be a time factor there where you say again and see if the difference is too much or too little, then so that history could be built.
NVM Express also has a recently released hardware or management specification for getting things like temperature through SMBus. Do you see that as being complementary to this approach?
Yeah, absolutely. The method that we used is very, actually, from a point of view of how BMC probes and pulls the data is exactly similar. And the NVMe MI had this appendix for that, and they call it as NVMe Basic Management, which is a pretty similar method. Now, NVMe MI itself has a pretty good specification out there to do much more advanced management. If you want to really pull a lot of logs out of the system, or if you want to really act as both slave and master from a point of view of an SSD, or if you want to really reset a system, like you can do an NVM subsystem reset or NVM endpoint reset. If you want to do those advanced type of activities, then going all the way to NVMe MI and implementing that really is needed. But remember, that runs on a MCTP transport, so you need to implement the transport itself in order to run that, both on the BMC side, and you need to develop another driver. Basically, I think NVMe MI committee may be already developing that, so you need to install that driver within the BMC. Here, it requires a simple I2C SMBus driver, which is part of almost every BMC already. So those additional changes would be required to take advantage of that. But that's for a little more advanced.
Yeah, I think the question would be, would you be encouraging folks to also implement a TMP style interface as well as NVMe in the management interface? Or if the device vendors just provide that management interface, would that be sufficient since it does provide temperature?
It is possible. I mean, when we implemented this, the NVMe MI was not there. So this was what was available, and then we thought this is a good start. Yeah, obviously, I think the merits of having that other one, if you have already implemented this one, then you could do that just to monitor the other aspect of SSD as I mentioned. Otherwise, temperature monitoring is one of the things already covered as part of NVMe basic management. So you could simply go there and implement that.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have a couple of questions actually. So one is in your testing. So have you have you guys characterized what is the impact on the I/O performance and the latencies when you're doing this out-of-band management, and basically at different intervals versus how does it compare to the in-band management?
Out-of-band management mainly takes out your host CPU out of the picture. So that way,
I'm talking about in terms of the latencies, the I/O performance impacts.
True. Well, out-of-band management has a tendency to affect performance if you do it too quickly enough. Meaning, if you have a certain interval, depending on your type of controller, type of workload, we see, like in our case, the first implementation of this was done on a PCIe board which had a SATA interface on the back of it. So there, the performance could be really, could have a negative impact if you do the polling more often, because there we pull the temperature off of each of the sensors and then aggregate it and then present it through an I2C interface. So the back, we were actually going over SATA, and that we did once every 4 minutes because we didn't have to have, we didn't want to introduce any negative performance impact. But moving forward, when you're talking about just PCI and NVMe, the out-of-band management itself, even if you do every so often, like once in a few seconds, it should not really impact the performance so much. I'm talking about from a point of view of latency.
So is there data which you can share?
We are still gathering some of the data on NVMe because the previous experiment was done on, or this implementation was done on a controller which had a SATA interface to all our flash models in the back. So we will share those results when we get them. Anything else? Thank you so much.
We'll take 5 minutes break. The next presentation will be Redfish, and it will be in this room here at 11. At 11 o'clock.
Yeah, oh, you know, yeah, take one, I want to take a picture of you. You know, just because it's too
You didn't take while I was talking.
I did. I did, yeah.